The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Montana plains, blanketing the world in a cold so deep it seemed to freeze the very air itself. Jacob Thornton pulled his wool coat tighter as he guided his wagon through the drifts, the wheels cutting frozen furrows in the white expanse. His breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized and fell like tiny diamonds in the lamplight swaying from the wagon's side. It was Christmas Eve, though Jacob hadn't given much thought to the holiday in years, not since Mary died, taking with her the warmth that had made his cabin feel like home instead of just shelter. Now the approaching holiday felt like an accusation, a reminder of all the joy that had been stripped from his life by fever and bitter loneliness. The supply run to Fort Benton had taken longer than expected, and now darkness was falling fast across the territory. Jacob knew these roads well enough to travel them blind, but the storm was getting worse, and even familiar landmarks looked alien under their burden of snow. He was still 10 miles from home when he saw the dark shape huddled beside the trail. At first, he thought it was a fallen log or perhaps a deer that had died in the cold. But as his wagon drew closer, the shape moved, a small, desperate motion that spoke of life clinging to its last threads. Jacob pulled the horses to a halt and climbed down, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, a small figure wrapped in what had once been a deerskin dress, but was now little more than rags. Her long black hair was matted with ice, and her lips had taken on the blue-gray color that meant the cold was winning its battle against her body. She was Blackfoot, Jacob realized, though what she was doing alone on this desolate road in the middle of a blizzard was beyond his comprehension. "Hey there, little one," Jacob said softly, kneeling beside her. The child's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. She tried to speak, but only a whisper of breath emerged from her frozen lips. Jacob didn't hesitate. He pulled off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around the child's tiny frame, then lifted her carefully in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird made of hollow bones and fading hope. Her skin was so cold it burned his hands through his shirt, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. "I've got you," he murmured, carrying her to the wagon. "You're going to be all right." The child tried to focus on his face, her eyes struggling to stay open. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind. "Grandfather told me, find the kind white man who lives by the 3 cottonwoods." Jacob's heart clenched. She had been looking for him, specifically for him, though he couldn't imagine why. His cabin did indeed sit beside 3 ancient cottonwoods, landmarks that could be seen for miles across the plains. But what would bring a Blackfoot child to his door in the middle of a blizzard? He wrapped her in every blanket he could find in the wagon, then urged his horses forward at a pace that balanced speed with safety. The storm was getting worse, but Jacob had spent 15 years on this land, and he knew every rock and rise between here and home. The child drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, sometimes mumbling words in her native tongue, sometimes just breathing so quietly he had to lean close to make sure she was still alive. By the time they reached his cabin, the child was burning with fever. Jacob carried her inside and laid her on his own bed, stoking the fire until the room blazed with warmth. He heated water and gently cleaned the ice from her hair, wrapped her in his warmest blankets, and tried to get her to drink small sips of warm broth. She was delirious now, speaking in rapid Blackfoot, punctuated by moments of clarity when her eyes would find his and she would try to tell him something important. Jacob didn't speak her language, but he understood the urgency in her voice, the way she kept pointing toward the door, as if expecting someone to arrive. "Easy, little one," he said, smoothing her hair back from her burning forehead. "You're safe now. Rest." But she couldn't rest. Even in her delirium, she seemed to be fighting against time itself, as if she had a message to deliver that couldn't wait for her recovery. Jacob sat beside her through the night, feeding the fire, monitoring her breathing, and wondering what chain of events had brought this child to his doorstep As dawn approached, her fever finally broke. The child's eyes opened clearly for the first time, and she looked at Jacob with recognition and something that might have been relief. You are Jacob Thornton," she whispered. "I am," he confirmed, surprised again to be known by name. "What's your name, little one?" "I am called Ayana," she said, her voice stronger now. "It means eternal blossom. My grandfather. He said you would help." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "Your grandfather. What's his name?" "Standing Bear. He is chief of our band." Ayana struggled to sit up, her small face grave with purpose. "He sent me to find you because he is dying." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Standing Bear. He remembered the name, remembered the man. 3 years ago, when Jacob had been caught in a late spring blizzard while checking his trap lines, he had taken shelter in a Blackfoot camp. The people there had shared their food and warmth with him, treating him not as an enemy, but as a fellow human being in need of help. Standing Bear had been the chief then, a man of perhaps 60 years with intelligent eyes and a quiet dignity that commanded respect. He had spoken some English, learned from traders and missionaries, and he had sat with Jacob by the fire, sharing stories and wisdom while the storm raged outside. "I remember him," Jacob said quietly. "He helped me once. Saved my life, probably." Ayana nodded. "He remembers too. He said you were different from other white men, that you saw people, not just skin color." Her voice grew urgent. "He is dying, and our band, we are starving. The soldiers drove us from our winter camp, said we were too close to the settlement. But there is no game where they sent us, no shelter. The old ones and the children, they are dying." Jacob felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders. He had seen it before, the systematic destruction of native peoples, the casual cruelty of displacement, the way authorities could condemn entire communities to death and call it policy. "What does your grandfather want from me?" he asked. Ayana's eyes filled with tears. He wants you to come, to see him before he dies. He says you are the only white man he trusts to remember us truly, to tell our story when we are gone." Jacob stared at the child, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. To travel to a starving Blackfoot camp in the middle of winter would be dangerous enough. To do so as a white man, when tensions between the races were at their highest, could easily be a death sentence. But to refuse would mean turning his back on people who had once shown him kindness when he needed it most. "How far?" he asked. 2 days' ride to the north, in the valley below Eagle's Peak." Ayana's voice was barely above a whisper. "Will you come?" Jacob looked at the child, so small, so fragile, yet possessed of a courage that humbled him. She had traveled alone through a blizzard, nearly dying in the process, to bring him a message from her dying grandfather. How could he do less than honor that sacrifice? "I'll come," he said, "but first you need to get your strength back, and I need to gather some supplies." Over the next 2 days, Jacob prepared for the journey while Ayana recovered. He loaded his wagon with everything he could spare: flour, coffee, beans, jerky, blankets, medicine. It wasn't much, but it might make the difference between life and death for people who had nothing. Ayana proved to be a resilient child, bouncing back from her ordeal with the quick healing of youth. She helped Jacob pack, her small hands careful with the precious supplies, and told him stories of her people, their customs, their struggles. Through her words, Jacob began to understand the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen Standing Bear's band. They had been forced from their traditional winter camp by a new military commander who believed that keeping natives close to settlements encouraged raiding. Never mind that Standing Bear's people had been peaceful, living quietly on land that had been theirs for generations. The new camp they had been assigned was a windswept valley with no shelter, no game, and no way to survive the harsh Montana winter. "The soldiers said we could get food from the agency," Ayana explained as they prepared to leave. But the agency is 50 miles away, and they only give food to those who agree to go to the reservation. Grandfather will not abandon our sacred places." Jacob nodded, understanding the impossible choice Standing Bear faced. Give up everything that made life meaningful, or watch his people slowly starve. It was a choice no human being should have to make. The journey north took them through some of the most desolate country Jacob had ever seen. The wind howled across the plains with a ferocity that cut through even the warmest clothes, and the snow lay so deep in places that the wagon could barely push through. But Ayana proved to be an excellent guide, knowing shortcuts and sheltered routes that saved them hours of travel. On the evening of the second day, they crested a rise and saw the Blackfoot camp below. Jacob's heart sank at the sight. What should have been a thriving winter village was instead a collection of makeshift shelters, more like a refugee camp than a home. Smoke rose from only a few fires, and the people he could see moved with the slow, careful motions of those conserving their strength. "We are here," Ayana said quietly. "That is my grandfather's lodge." She pointed to a slightly larger structure near the center of the camp. Jacob drove the wagon down into the valley, aware of the stares and whispers his presence generated. Some of the people looked frightened, others hostile, but most just seemed too tired and hungry to care much about anything. Children with hollow cheeks and adults with the gaunt look of starvation watched him pass with eyes that had seen too much suffering. Standing Bear's lodge was warm inside, heated by a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the hide walls. The chief lay on a bed of furs, his once powerful frame reduced to skin and bone. But his eyes were still sharp, still intelligent, and they lit up when he saw Jacob enter. "My friend," Standing Bear said in English, his voice weak but clear. "You came." Jacob knelt beside the dying man, taking his hand. "I came as soon as I could. I brought supplies, food, blankets, medicine." Standing Bear smiled. "I knew you would. Ayana told me about your kindness, how you gave her your coat without hesitation. That is the man I remembered." "You saved my life once," Jacob said simply. "I owed you that much." "You owed me nothing," Standing Bear replied, "but you came anyway. That is why I wanted to see you before I die, to know that there are still good people in this world, regardless of the color of their skin." Over the next few hours, Jacob distributed the supplies he had brought. It wasn't enough to solve the band's problems, but it was enough to buy them time, to give them hope that they might survive until spring. He worked alongside the Blackfoot people, helping to prepare food and tend to the sick, and gradually began to earn their acceptance. Standing Bear lingered for 3 more days, using his remaining strength to tell Jacob the stories of his people, their history, their beliefs, their hopes for the future. He spoke of the old days when the buffalo ran thick across the plains, when his people could follow the ancient rhythms of the seasons without interference from soldiers or bureaucrats. "We are not asking for much," the old chief said on his final night. "Just the right to live as our ancestors lived, to honor the sacred places, to raise our children in the old ways. But they say we are obstacles to progress, that we must change or die." Jacob felt the weight of those words, understanding that he was witnessing the end of an era. These people weren't just facing starvation, they were facing the extinction of their entire way of life. Standing Bear died quietly in the early hours of the morning, surrounded by his family and the man who had once been a stranger but had become a friend. Jacob helped prepare the body according to Blackfoot custom, learning rituals that had been practiced for countless generations. The funeral was held at sunset, with the entire band gathered despite their weakness and hunger. Standing Bear was wrapped in his finest robes and placed on a platform built high above the ground, where his spirit could easily find its way to the next world. The people sang songs that had been old when the first white men came to the territory, songs that spoke of courage and honor and the eternal cycle of life and death. As the ceremony concluded, Standing Bear's son, a man named Running Wolf, approached Jacob. My father spoke of you often in his final days, he said. He said you were proof that not all white men are our enemies. He asked me to give you this. Running Wolf pressed a small object into Jacob's hand, a carved stone medallion depicting a wolf howling at the moon. This was my grandfather's and his grandfather's before him. My father wanted you to have it, to remember us when we are gone. Jacob looked at the medallion, feeling the weight of the gift. You're not going to die, he said firmly. I won't let that happen. Running Wolf smiled sadly. You are one man, my friend. What can you do against the forces that seek to destroy us? Jacob didn't answer immediately. He looked around the camp at the faces of the people who had trusted him, who had welcomed him despite every reason to view him as an enemy. These were good people, people who deserved to live, to prosper, to pass their culture on to their children. I don't know, he said finally, but I have to try. The journey back to his cabin gave Jacob time to think, to plan, to decide what he was going to do with the rest of his life. He could return to his quiet existence, content in the knowledge that he had done what he could for Standing Bear's people. Or he could try to make a real difference, to use his position as a white man to advocate for people who had no voice in the broader world. By the time he reached home, Jacob had made his decision. Over the following weeks, he began reaching out to everyone he could think of: army officers, territorial officials, newspaper editors, church leaders. He told Standing Bear's story over and over, describing the dignity of the dying chief and the desperate plight of his people. He used every connection he had, every favor he was owed, every argument he could muster. Most people listened politely and did nothing. Some dismissed him as an Indian lover who had been deceived by savages. A few threatened violence if he continued to interfere with government policy. But slowly, gradually, Jacob began to find allies, people who were horrified by what was happening and willing to help. The breakthrough came when Jacob managed to arrange a meeting with the territorial governor. The man was a politician first and foremost, but he was also facing re-election and had been hearing more and more complaints about the treatment of native peoples. When Jacob laid out the situation in stark terms, people dying of starvation while the government looked the other way, the governor began to see the political implications. "What do you want me to do?" the governor asked. "Give them a chance," Jacob replied. "Let them return to their traditional winter camp. Provide them with enough supplies to survive until spring. Show them that the government can be trusted to keep its word." The governor was silent for a long moment. "And if they cause trouble, if they raid settlements or attack travelers?" "They won't," Jacob said with conviction. "These are peaceful people who just want to live their lives in peace. Give them that chance, and they'll prove you right." It took 2 more weeks of negotiations, but eventually Jacob got what he wanted. The governor issued an order allowing Standing Bear's band to return to their original winter camp, along with a promise of food and supplies to help them survive the rest of the winter. Jacob was the one who carried the news to the Blackfoot camp, riding through a spring blizzard to reach the valley below Eagle's Peak. The people's joy at hearing the news was almost overwhelming. Children laughed for the first time in months, adults wept with relief, and the elders began planning for the move back to their sacred places. But Running Wolf pulled Jacob aside privately. "This is good news," he said. "But what happens next winter? What happens when the governor changes his mind or when a new governor takes office?" Jacob had been thinking about the same question. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll be watching, and I'll keep fighting for your people as long as I have breath in my body." Running Wolf nodded. "My father was right about you. You are a man of honor." The move back to the traditional winter camp took place in late March, as the worst of the winter weather finally began to break. Jacob helped organize the convoy, using his wagon to transport the elderly and the supplies the government had provided. It was a slow process, but there was a sense of hope in the air that hadn't been there before. The traditional camp was everything Standing Bear had described: a sheltered valley with good water, plenty of game, and the spiritual significance that came from generations of occupation. The people worked with renewed energy to rebuild their lodges and restore their community. Jacob stayed for a week, helping with the reconstruction and enjoying the hospitality of people who had every reason to distrust him but had chosen to embrace him instead. On his last night, the band held a feast in his honor, with speeches and stories and songs that celebrated their friendship. As the evening wound down, old White Crow, the band's medicine man, approached Jacob with a serious expression. "I have seen you in my dreams," he said. "The spirits have shown me that you will be blessed for what you have done here." Jacob smiled. "I've already been blessed. I've been privileged to know good people and to help them in their time of need." White Crow shook his head. "No, my friend. The blessing is yet to come. The spirits are grateful for your kindness, and they will repay it in ways you cannot imagine." Jacob didn't put much stock in prophecies or spiritual visions, but he thanked the old man for his words and prepared to leave the next morning. As he hitched up his wagon, nearly the entire band gathered to see him off. Children ran alongside his wagon as he drove away, and adults called out blessings in their native tongue. The journey home was uneventful, but Jacob felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. He had made a difference, had helped good people in their time of need, had honored the memory of a man who had once helped him. Whatever came next, he could face it with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the promise of renewal and new beginnings. Jacob went about his usual routines, tending his small garden, maintaining his cabin, checking his trap lines. But he found himself thinking often about Standing Bear's people, wondering how they were faring in their traditional camp. He got his answer on a warm morning in May when he woke to find his yard filled with people. Blackfoot families had arrived during the night, setting up temporary camps around his cabin. Men, women, and children filled the space between his house and the cottonwoods, all dressed in their finest clothes and carrying gifts. Jacob stepped out onto his porch, overwhelmed by the sight. There had to be 50 people in his yard, maybe more, all watching him with expressions of respect and gratitude. Running Wolf stepped forward from the crowd, carrying a beautifully decorated pipe. "My friend," Running Wolf said formally, "we have come to honor you and to bless your home. You gave kindness to a dying child, and through that kindness, you saved our people. The spirits have told us that your generosity must be repaid." What followed was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. The Blackfoot families had brought gifts, beaded clothing, carved tools, weapons, jewelry, food. But more than that, they had brought ceremony, ritual, and the blessing of an entire people. White Crow painted sacred symbols on Jacob's door and windows, asking the spirits to protect the home of a good man. The women sang songs that called for prosperity and happiness to dwell within his walls. The men performed dances that honored his courage and generosity. The children scattered flower petals around his cabin, creating a carpet of color and beauty. As the ceremony concluded, Ayana, now healthy and strong, approached Jacob with a small bundle in her arms. "This is for you," she said shyly. "A gift from my grandfather's spirit." Jacob unwrapped the bundle to find a blanket of extraordinary beauty, woven from the finest materials and decorated with symbols that told the story of their friendship. In the center was an image of a man giving his coat to a child, surrounded by images of eagles, wolves, and other sacred animals. "It will remind you that you are not alone," Ayana said. "That you have a family among the Blackfoot people, and that you will always be welcome in our lodges." Jacob felt tears streaming down his face as he accepted the gift. "Thank you," he whispered. "All of you. This means more to me than you can know." The families stayed for 3 days, turning Jacob's quiet homestead into a celebration of friendship and gratitude. They shared stories, taught him more of their language and customs, and included him in their daily rituals. When they finally prepared to leave, Jacob felt as though he was saying goodbye to beloved relatives. But Running Wolf had one more surprise. "We have decided to establish a permanent camp near here," he announced. "Not on your land, but close enough that we can visit regularly. The valley to the north has good water and plenty of game. If you have no objection, we would like to make it our summer home." Jacob couldn't have been more pleased. "I would be honored to have you as neighbors." And so it was that Jacob Thornton, a lonely rancher who had once given his coat to a freezing child, found himself at the center of a new kind of community. The Blackfoot families did indeed establish their summer camp in the northern valley, and Jacob became a regular visitor, learning their ways and sharing his own knowledge in return. Over the years, Jacob's cabin became a meeting place between two worlds. White travelers would often stop there, drawn by his reputation for hospitality, and they would encounter Blackfoot visitors who challenged their preconceptions about native peoples. Gradually, understanding began to replace fear, and cooperation began to replace conflict. Jacob never married, but he was never lonely again. He had found something more valuable than a wife and children. He had found a place where he belonged, where his actions mattered, where his life had meaning beyond his own survival. The medallion Standing Bear had given him became his most treasured possession, a reminder of the friendship that had changed his life. And the blanket Ayana had presented to him remained on his bed until the day he died, a testament to the truth that kindness, once given, returns to bless the giver in ways beyond imagination. When Jacob finally passed away, at the age of 78, he was surrounded by both white and Blackfoot friends. His funeral was conducted according to the customs of both peoples, and he was buried in the valley where Standing Bear's people had made their summer home, overlooking the 3 cottonwoods that had first marked him as a man worth knowing. The inscription on his simple wooden marker, carved in both English and Blackfoot, read simply, "Jacob Thornton, friend to all people." But those who knew him best remembered him as the man who had given his coat to a dying child, and in doing so had discovered the true meaning of wealth.